Ajit, are these the strongest rules ever proposed?
Well, one thing is for sure, it is a monumental shift toward government control of how the internet works, and that's about the best thing I can say about it.
So what's the worst thing about it?
Well, I think the worst thing is that it micromanages virtually every aspect of how the internet operates. It opens the door to billions of dollars in new taxes on broadband that consumers are going to have to pay. It will lead to slower broadband speeds. It opens the door to trial lawyers filing class actions across the country, and litigation usually isn't the best way to ensure innovation. There are a whole host of harms that are going to happen, and that's why I only wish you could see this 332-page plan, which won't become public until after the FCC votes on it.
I can see it. It looks like a phone book. All right, so Ajit, let's talk about these and kind of go through those objections one by one, because you've listed a handful of them. And let's start with the micromanagement. I mean, at some point, and I'll take the other side just because I can, at some point, if the skirmish is happening at this place, at this last mile, at the moment in which a user is trying to get the information to try and get off the back of the internet, isn't that the place where the regulation has to happen and get involved if there's to be any regulation?
So there are two responses to that. First, nowhere in this document does the agency ever identify any systemic problem with last-mile connectivity. Now, they might say the competition is limited, but they don't give any examples of ISPs acting as anti-competitive gatekeepers that in such a way that industry-wide rules are necessary. Secondly, this document goes well beyond last-mile connectivity. For the first time, the agency would insert itself into debates over interconnection, the negotiations between internet service providers and edge providers. It would set not only the requirement that companies physically interconnect, but also the rates that they would have to adopt, and it would open up a complaint process, again, more litigation, that would allow essentially either the commission or courts to second-guess all of these decisions, which currently are made in the free market. And that's not something I think the agency or the courts are equipped to do.
Well, you know, a lot of this hinges on sort of the guiding principles of how to administer this. And what Tom Wheeler wrote about it in Wired in his op-ed there is he talked about this commercial reasonableness and his evolution of what he thought about that, what that meant. And I think what he said, I'll shorten what he said a little bit, but essentially he said, you know, I believe the FCC could, you know, figure it out what commercial reasonableness meant. But he said, I became concerned that this relatively new concept of commercial reasonableness might down the road be interpreted to mean what's reasonable for commercial interests, not consumers. What do you think it should mean? Should the rules be there to promote what's reasonable for business or for the users of the internet itself?
I view our role at the FCC as vindicating the public interest, and in my opinion, the public interest is driven primarily, fundamentally, by what is good for American consumers. But putting that to the side, the question about commercial reasonableness or not is something we've applied in a great many contexts, and I'm sure we could do it here to vindicate the consumer interest. But what really happened in this case was the president, in unprecedented fashion, directing the FCC in early November to change course, to adopt his plan to regulate the internet. And that, more than any change of mind, I think, is what's driving this bus.
Now, taxes. You mentioned heavy taxes. Isn't there already a rule in place, you know, the Internet Tax Freedom Act, that prevents there from being any taxes on the internet? How could that lead to more taxes?
This is a critical point. The Internet Tax Freedom Act only applies to essentially a sales tax on internet access. It does not apply to the fees that would necessarily follow from us reclassifying broadband as a telecommunications service, which is what we're on the brink of doing. And so if you look on your phone bill and you see that universal service fee, this order explicitly leaves the door open to us raising the federal fees under the Universal Service Fund and letting states do the same. And that's why one independent study said that $11 billion at least in new fees will have to be increased as a result of this reclassification. And that's something that consumers are going to have to pay for, regardless of that new legislation.
Well, that was the Progressive Policy Institute study at $11 billion. That was the high end of their estimate, yes?
Well, you might say it's the high end. On the other hand, who would have thought a year ago that the FCC would all of a sudden spend $1.5 billion to expand our E-rate program? Who would have thought that the agency would contemplate dramatically broadening the Lifeline program? And these are all parts of the Universal Service Fund program that is funded by those fees. And so if you look at the FCC's spending ambitions, that spending is going to have to come at a price. And that price is going to be paid by consumers through the Universal Service Fund fees that are assessed on broadband as a result of this order.
When we just talk about the FCC and party lines, we tend to sort of, knuckleheads like me, abbreviate and say the Republican commissioners, the Democratic commissioners, those appointed by Democrats, as if those are really strong party lines. Is there a possibility that you can convince some of your other commissioners that this rule proposed and indeed led by some ideas from a Democratic president might be worth them voting against?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to persuade my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but what I can tell you is that I stand in the shoes of President Clinton and in the shoes of Chairman Kennard and Chairman Janikowski, each of whom embraced the bipartisan, light-touch regulatory consensus that has served this country so well when it comes to broadband, dating back to the days of 56K modems and AOL Internet access disks coming in the mail. I think the American broadband success story has been a good one, and it's in part because these issues have not been political until very recently. And if you look at reporting in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, it becomes pretty clear that this has been a politically driven agenda for a couple of months now. And that's unfortunate because at the end of the day, digital opportunity is something that doesn't know a political affiliation.
I mean, you talk about increased litigation or political issues are going to be political. I mean, you talked about litigation. I mean, isn't any rule going to in some way invite some litigation? Is that really something that's different with this rule than any other?
Well, I think that the question is whether these rules are necessary in the first place. I've said that net neutrality rules of this kind are a solution in search of a problem. What I think would definitely not inspire litigation would be for the FCC to adopt some broadband deployment-friendly policies, getting rid of some of the legacy regulations that are still on the books, making it easier to deploy wireless infrastructure, getting more spectrum out into the commercial marketplace. I can assure you that not one person in this country, well, I shouldn't say not one, most people in this country would not find anything problematic about that. They'd love to have more broadband choice at better prices and higher speeds. And net neutrality regulations, though, simply take us in the opposite direction. And in generating litigation for the sake of making a political point, I don't think is good for anybody.